For years, Russia's secret weapon has been touted as Kaliningrad. Tucked between Poland and Lithuania, many believe the Russian exclave is where a war with NATO would start. And it would be a threat. Stored, there are weapons. From Kaliningrad, missiles that may be capable of carrying nuclear weapons could be launched. That Russia's hold on its exclave is stronger than ever is what the Kremlin wants you to believe. The Kremlin is lying. As the Kremlin is losing control of one of its most important territories, Vladimir Putin's grip on Kaliningrad is slipping. And to see Putin panicking, we only need to look at the rhetoric coming out of Russia right now. Of course, in public himself, Putin would never panic. Instead, at anybody who will listen, he employs an army of lackeys and mouthpieces to hurl threats, accusations, and lies. And in that army of sycophants, one of the strongest voices is the man who has been causing a lot of fuss about a supposed war between Russia and NATO, Sergei Lavrov, Sergei Lavrov. To claim that NATO is waging war against Russia, ever since Putin launched his supposed special military operation in Ukraine, has become the stock in trade of one of Putin's favorite mouthpieces. It was only a few months after that initial invasion failed, and Western support started pouring into Ukraine, that Lavrov started flinging his accusations around. On comments that Lavrov made in May 2022, Sky News reported, where he claimed that through its support of Ukraine, via sanctions and military aid, the collective West had declared a total hybrid war against Russia. We did everything to avoid a direct clash, but now that the challenge has been thrown down, we of course accept it, Lavrov claimed at the time. We are no strangers to sanctions. They were almost always there in one form or another. Through his mouthpiece, the message Putin wants to get across is twofold. NATO has started a fight. Russia is ready to win that fight. Fast forward to September 2025, and out of Lavrov's mouth, the same old nonsense has been coming. This time, Lavrov is claiming that on Russia, everybody who supports Ukraine has declared war, because the rest of Europe has the outright gall to respond, as any continent should respond to Russia's constant acts of aggression. At the Group of 20, or G20, meeting of foreign ministers at the United Nations, or UN, in September, Lavrov appeared, repeating his claims that by aiding Ukraine in its fight against Russia, the West had provoked a crisis. Worse yet, Lavrov suggested that a direct conflict with Russia involved NATO, the European Union, and even the UN itself. A false narrative Russia has been propagating for a while is this, and it all plays into something that the host of the Russian Dude YouTube channel Artem Dikarev calls a desperate need by Russia for it to constantly play the victim as it battles against NATO. And in this desperation, we start to see that directly linked to the situation in Kaliningrad right now are Lavrov's words. At the G20, at the UN, at whatever international cocktail party he can sneak into, Lavrov repeats the same Putin conspiracy theory: the West has declared war on Russia. Dikarev says, surrounded by monsters is the poor Kaliningrad exclave, and Moscow will deliver a decisive response. As the eternal victim, Russia is painted, conveniently ignoring the brutality it has unleashed on Ukraine to claim that every attempt Europe makes to defend itself and Ukraine against Russian aggression is somehow the start of a war. The war has long since started. The country that started it was Russia. The secret that the Kremlin doesn't want anybody to discover is hidden by Russia's need to paint itself as the eternal victim. If you read behind the lines of Lavrov's claims and his attempts to intimidate the West into not doing what it is currently doing in response to Russia's actions, you can see it. A message that he doesn't intend to send is being sent by Lavrov, not just about the Russian Federation as a whole, but about the Kaliningrad exclave that Russia has long used to project power. Behind the smoke, the chest thumping, and the decisive response talk lies a crumbling reality, Dikarev says. The Kremlin is terrified. In Lavrov's words, What Dikarev sees is the ramblings of a paranoid man who knows that at any time it sees fit, the West could take Kaliningrad away from Russia. That's why for NATO or any other perceived Russian enemy, Lavrov's words aren't really intended, Dikarev suggests. To project power to the Russian people, rather than to the supposed enemies and attacks of the Russian state, Lavrov, and by extension, Putin, aims to use the threats Russia is levying. And an approach that has the potential to work is this, at least in mainland Russia, where from official Russian news sources, the vast majority of people get most of their information. The issue is highlighted by Reporters Without Borders, noting that from Russian television, around 2/3 of Russians get almost all of their news. State-owned and controlled are all the stations they watch, meaning the specific narrative that the Kremlin wants them to hear is fed to the average Russian. And right now, to deliver the message that NATO and the European Union, or EU, are threats, and Russia needs to prepare, are the words coming out of Lavrov's mouth. Plenty in Russia have internet connections, of course. The country's internet connection rate is very high, Reporters Without Borders points out. But even that often isn't enough to break through the Kremlin's propaganda push. That fact is highlighted by the Center for Data and Research, or CDR, in a March 2025 report. It says that inside Russia, independent media can still operate despite state censorship. On the internet to get its message out, most of that media has to rely, and that's where the problem lies. The platform of choice is often Telegram, but 44% of Russians who responded to a CEDAR survey said that on the social media site, they purposefully only follow pro-government channels. By contrast, what CEDAR calls oppositional channels is followed by only 14%, suggesting that not only is the average Russian being led down the garden path with a false narrative, but they're willing to hold the Kremlin's hand as they walk that path, especially when it comes to Kaliningrad. Russia's problem is that a narrative that may work on what some might call the willfully ignorant Russian public is nowhere near as effective at intimidating those who really matter to Russia. The Russian elite realized it's near impossible to make smart people believe their lies, Dikarev says. So they focused on those who will. At Russians themselves it's aimed. At starving through sanctions, losing sons on the battlefield, and seeing the economy bleed out, that all these things are necessary sacrifices because NATO is coming, is what Lavrov needs to convince the population. That message the average Russian needs to believe for Lavrov and the Kremlin. And while on the mainland the propaganda may work, a different kettle of fish is Kaliningrad. That NATO and the EU are the enemies that the Kremlin wants to position them as. Russia may find it a lot harder to convince the people living in that tiny exclave. And it is this very barrier to convincing Kaliningrad as people, it could lead to Putin losing control over the entire exclave. Later in the video, we'll come back to that point. For now, on the Kaliningrad problem that Russia has, let's hone in. As stretching almost Europe-wide, the Kremlin sees this problem, with NATO easing across the continent during the last few decades being Russia's main bone of contention. Of course, as Dikarev points out, Russia's claims that NATO expands to threaten Russia aren't true. NATO didn't expand because Brussels was itching to poke the bear, he says. It expanded because every neighbor of Russia looked at Moscow's track record and said no, not trusting them. A semblance of a point Russia does have in that NATO is indeed expanding. In its tracking of the addition of NATO members over time, the ND International Security Center highlights this. When Putin came to power, NATO only had 19 members. Since 2000, around a dozen more have been added. Among those new members are Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Albania, Croatia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. However, the ones that really sting Russia are the states that are both close to the Russian mainland and could present a threat to Kaliningrad. In 2004, the three Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania all joined NATO, which had long held themselves to be somewhat neutral countries. Finland and Sweden joined in 2023 and 2024, respectively, both as responses to the Russian aggression seen in Ukraine. So yes, NATO expansion has occurred. That Russia brought all of this on itself with its actions in Europe over the last few decades is what Lavrov wants to hide. The invasion of Georgia, the annexation of Crimea, and most recently, the invasion of Ukraine. Those are the reasons why NATO has grown and may continue to grow in the future, to the point where to Russia and Kaliningrad, it represents a major threat. Of Kaliningrad's demise, Russia's actions could be the cause, and Putin knows it. That is why out to refute every claim that NATO and the EU make about Russia committing acts of aggression against those two organizations, he's sending Lavrov. And in typical Lavrov fashion, by a threat, every rebuke is also accompanied. That the EU, in particular, is openly planning to launch an attack on Kaliningrad is now being claimed by the Putin mouthpiece, which is another action that would be met with Russia's so-called decisive responses. By Lavrov, the militarization of the island of Bornholm has come under fire, as he claims that it is all part of the EU and NATO strategy to assert more control over the Baltic region. Bear in mind that part of NATO is practically every state in the Baltic, with the only scrap of territory that Russia controls in the region being Kaliningrad. Again, it's all messaging that ignores the fact that such buildups, along with the NATO expansion itself, are only happening because of the scale of the threat that Russia and Kaliningrad pose to the rest of Europe. This isn't the EU or NATO getting ready to invade. It is these organizations preparing to rip Kaliningrad out of Russia's control if Putin ever gets brave enough to fully declare the Europe-wide war that Russia's actions suggest that he wants. Aggressive, NATO and the EU aren't being. They're being smart. Thanks to Russia's actions, Kaliningrad is now in a very vulnerable position. Kaliningrad is surrounded, Ikarev says. It's isolated, and in modern warfare, its military bases could be flattened before Moscow even knows what happened. So, a grain of truth to the Kremlin propaganda exists in the sense that to Kaliningrad, NATO and the EU represent a very clear threat. It's just not the type of threat Lavrov wants people to believe it is. Unless Russia gives NATO a reason to launch that invasion, there will be no invasion of the Russian exclave. For now, to let Russia stew in the mess that it has made, NATO and the EU seem happy, all the while taking actions around Kaliningrad that terrify the Kremlin and further isolate Russia from its exclave. The militarization of islands we've already touched on. To consider, there's also the buildup of stronger border defenses in Poland and the Baltic states. Plus, a future where it struggles to even power Kaliningrad may soon be faced by Russia. As Euractiv reports from the Russian power grid, the Baltic region is in the process of divorcing itself. While that will hurt Russia in the sense that less energy revenue enters Putin's war chest, for Kaliningrad, it also causes problems. On the Baltic portion of the Russian grid to get its power, the exclave relies. When the Baltic nations switch off from Russia's power grid, they'll take Kaliningrad with it. The Baltic states have alternatives. Kaliningrad doesn't. Vulnerability rather than power projection is what every word out of Lavrov's mouth screams. At this point, about a potential invasion, as Lavrov constantly claims, everything Russia is saying about the NATO threat to Kaliningrad is less and more about the shot to Russia's pride that Putin's eroding grip on the exclave has caused. That's why NATO threats sting so much, because they cut into Russia's fragile pride. Dikarev notes, it's not just about strategy. It's about humiliation. If Kaliningrad is vulnerable, Russia itself, and more importantly, Putin, look vulnerable. That's the key. Putin's greatest fear is NATO's rhetoric. As an example, take the comments made by U.S. Army Europe and Africa Commander Chris Donahue back in July. As tensions continued to ramp up between NATO and Russia, Donahue said that, in a time frame that is unheard of, NATO has the ability to capture Kaliningrad if it needed to do so. Those words would have stung the Kremlin so much because they read not like Russia's attempts to threaten and intimidate. That his threats carry very little weight outside of Russia itself. Putin knows. He also knows that when a prominent NATO commander says that NATO could take Kaliningrad without trying, it's not just an empty threat. It is a statement of fact that reveals just how tenuous Russia's hold is on the exclave. Out of Putin, it's all paranoia seeping. And a giant radar installation that Russia is currently building in the exclave is there is no greater monument to the Kremlin sphere that it could lose Kaliningrad. In mid-August, news first broke of this installation when reports started emerging about satellite images suggesting the construction of a massive, circular disposed antenna array surfaced. Located just 25 kilometers from Kaliningrad's border with Poland, that radar array was supposed to communicate the message that on NATO, Russia has eyes. In our August video, we covered the array in plenty of depth, so check it out if you want to learn more about how Russia intends to use this new structure. Yet another attempt by Russia to project strength via Kaliningrad is the array. Further highlighting of Russia's insecurity is all it really achieves. To the Russian media, it's proof of strength, Dikarev proclaims. To Lavrov, it's a warning. We can see everything. We can neutralize all threats. But to NATO, it's a flashing neon sign of insecurity. And the exact opposite of what Russia expected was NATO's reaction to the radar array. The enemy was supposed to panic. It was supposed to beg Russia not to build this array. Instead, at a boondoggle that seems more in keeping with the Soviet era, NATO is letting Russia throw millions, perhaps even billions, of dollars. Their defenses, Poland and the Baltic states, with the help of NATO, will keep bolstering. As the rest of Kaliningrad, if a war broke out, Russia's giant eye on the Baltic would face the same fate, so to NATO, it's not threatening. Ever since Putin invaded Ukraine, weakness is all that Russia has managed to project via Kaliningrad. A radar array, no matter how massive it may be, from devastating Kaliningrad, isn't going to stop NATO's modern weapons, should the time come for them to do so. On many occasions, Putin himself has claimed that he isn't interested in engaging the West in an arms race. He was saying as much in 2018, following another landslide presidential win, and he's been saying it throughout the Ukraine war. To that claim, building a massive radar array would seem to run counter, Dikarev points out. It does, but as a tool to defend Kaliningrad, the likely uselessness of that array suggests that as a weapon, Putin doesn't see it. A symbol is how he sees it. A way to show NATO and the people living in Kaliningrad that Russia is still a player on the global stage, Dikarev says. And that brings us back to a point we raised earlier in the video about how it may end up being the people living in Kaliningrad who ultimately determine the exclave's fate. The real dirty little secret that hides behind Lavrov's threats and Russia as NATO fears isn't necessarily militaristic. In the fact that some of the exclave's people don't even see themselves as Russian citizens rests Russia's insecurity over Kaliningrad. At least, not in the same sense as those living in the motherland. How could they? Kaliningrad is isolated. As a pawn in the games it plays against Europe, Russia uses it, often paying little attention to what the territory's people actually want. That the people living in Kaliningrad are far more connected to their European neighbors than anybody in Russia itself tends to be hidden by Russia's propaganda. Kaliningrad isn't Moscow, Dikarev says. It isn't Siberia. It's a region that breathes Europe. Its people cross into Poland and Lithuania for shopping, study, and work. At least the ones who still can. With its European neighbors than the country trying to maintain its grip on the exclave, Kaliningrad has more in common. And for many in the exclave than continued use by Russia as a means to project power, integration into Europe is a far more desirable option. That fact is difficult to prove. Russia's suppression of information out of the exclave ensures that. However, that Kaliningrad likely has a silent, or perhaps silenced, majority that would love nothing more than for Russia to lose its grip is shown by one unofficial referendum conducted in 2023. On this referendum, the Human Security Center reported in July 2023, noting that it was unofficial and carried out online because such votes are deemed illegal by Russia. The simple question of whether they wanted to remain under Russian control or see Kaliningrad achieve independence was asked of residents. Whether it wants Russia to maintain that control, no territory that Russia controls can vote on. But the referendum happened anyway. That 95,567 people in Kaliningrad took part in that referendum is what the Human Security Center says, which is about a fifth of the exclave's population. That's large enough to be considered a suitable sample size, and to Putin, the outcome of the referendum sent a clear message. Out of the Russian Federation, Kaliningrad wants. After 13 days of the online vote being open, 72.1% of the exclave's population that took part said they would rather that Kaliningrad be independent than remain under Russian control. That is a big part of the population that outright rejects Russia's hold over their lives. It's no wonder about Kaliningrad's future. The Kremlin is so insecure. The discontent that has been looming in Kaliningrad for years has only been fed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. From the exclave, people who refer to themselves as Baltic Russians held a protest in front of the Russian embassy in Poland when Putin invaded Ukraine. The fact that this protest happened on the territory of a NATO member sends almost as strong a message about the desire for independence from Russia inside Kaliningrad as the protest itself. Thanks to the impact that Putin's invasion has had on Kaliningrad's people, more tensions are coming to the surface. Life in Kaliningrad has gotten worse, Nikarev says. Sanctions choke trade, tourism collapsed. Prices rise while wages stagnate. And every time Lavrov rants about defending Kaliningrad, locals roll their eyes because they know they're the ones paying the price. We come back to the Kremlin propaganda. On the surface, it's all part of what Russia usually does. NATO is attacking. Kaliningrad will be defended. However, that Russia's insecurity is showing is the reality. That NATO could topple Kaliningrad any time it wants to do so, Putin knows. But NATO may not have to. Rather than forcing Russia to relinquish the exclave, for Kaliningrad's people to extract themselves from Putin's once vice-like grip, NATO may just need to wait. Plenty since the Ukraine war began has that grip loosened. That Russia knows it's on the verge of losing control is shown by the ranting and raving of people like Lavrov. Speaking of propaganda and Russia's attempts to spread false messages about its strength, Ukraine has just caught Russia lying. Again, that it had taken control of the village of Verbov, Russia tried to say, only for Ukraine to prove that minutes after they entered the settlement, Russian infiltrators had been taken out. Find out more in our video. And remember to subscribe to Warzone Party if you want more coverage of the latest goings-on in Kaliningrad.